that we founded.
Yeah.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think why don't we get started. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelko, and I'm very fortunate to direct our Environmental Change and Security program here at the Center. And on behalf of my colleagues, it's our distinct pleasure to have what is in fact the fifth meeting in a series that we have entitled New Horizons at the Nexus of Conflict, Natural Resources, and Health. This is a series of programs that very much fits within what the Environmental Change and Security program has been trying to do for now I think 14 years, bringing these different worlds, these different communities, using very different languages, different methodologies, and different interventions together to have dialogue and exchange on analytical links on the research side, the academic side, and to bring that into a policy and practitioner discussion. Some very different policy and practitioner communities working on these range of issues. So we do that here at the Wilson Center, which is, as I think many of you know, is the nonpartisan, non-advocacy memorial to Woodrow Wilson. So we were set up by Congress in 1968 to be this forum where the worlds of scholarship and the worlds of policy can come together. So we do that quite a bit with in the form of meetings, in the form of publications, some of which I hope you will pick up on the table out front, and really trying to get these communities together to discuss new and cutting-edge research, which is what we're doing today with our session entitled Fertile Fringes, Population Growth at Protected Area Edges. Justin Brashares and George Wittemyer have co-authored a piece in Science that you're going to hear about, one that is it's always more interesting in many ways when some of the results are to some degree counterintuitive or running against the dominant framing of an issue, and I think that's what we have here today. So we wanted to have them come tell us about their work in terms of looking at populations and services in and around protected areas and biodiverse rich areas. And then Jason Bremner, who is a longtime friend of the center here in town at Population Reference Bureau, is going to heads their POP and Environment program and is going to provide some discussion comments to kick off our discussion as we engage everyone here in the room. Just a couple notes before turning it over to Justin. One is that we're webcasting the event live, so what that means for us is really nothing except when we come to the Q&A, I ask that you wait for one of my colleagues to come to you with a microphone so the folks online can hear what you have to ask and say. The video is live but then also archived, so you'll be able to direct people to it in the future. And then the other, like so many of these meetings, it's our great pleasure to thank USAID for their support. Although in this case, it's long time. It's been Office of Population and Reproductive Health. In this case of this series, we've added 2 additional partners, which is, I think, notable because it's sometimes very difficult for folks in government agencies to work across their different divisions and their different silos. So the Conflict Management and Mitigation Office, as well as the Natural Resource Team, the biodiversity folks, have come together to make this series possible. So it's terrific to see folks from those different parts of the agency here and to have their support and partnership in bringing this series to fruition. Speaking of the series, the final meeting is next month. It's November 12th. It's entitled Sustaining Natural Resources and Environmental Integrity During Response to Crisis and Conflict. So how do you do conservation, natural resource management in a post-conflict setting? We have 3 excellent speakers. It'll be in this room on November 12th, and I look forward to seeing you all back here. So I'm going to turn it over to Justin Brashares, who's Assistant Professor of Ecology and Conservation in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management, University of California, Berkeley. You can see in the handout his more details on his bio, and I urge you to look at that to see where he has been working. George Wittemyer is Assistant Professor in the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at Colorado State University, but we can update us if we're behind on that in terms of times in Portland as well. And then Jason, as I mentioned, is here in town at PRB. So Justin, why don't we turn the floor over to you to get us started.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. So George and I are very excited to be here, and we're grateful for the invitation. Actually, only one invitation was extended, and we managed to leverage our way into 2. And the reason we did that is because this was, as is not always the case, this was a truly collaborative effort. And I like to think that neither one of us could have done it without the other. We've also benefited, as collaborators often do, from bouncing things off one another. So you may see a bit of a Abbott and Costello here today. Unfortunately, we're chained to our desks or our chairs, so we can't do our... in fact, you'll see me gesticulating and other things, which is what I usually like to do. George and I started this work almost exactly 2 years ago, in this effort to examine demographic responses to protected areas. And our stated goal at that time was to increase the dialogue, increase communication and debate between the conservation, biology, and development communities. And I know we're not the first to try and push for this, and by no means will we be the last. But I would say in publishing our work this summer, we've started to see that happen as it relates to the places we work and the issues that we care about. So that's been very exciting for us. There's certainly been discussion, and there's also been a lot of debate, and we will touch on some of that in our talk today. And basically, in our short presentation, we'll be passing the baton back and forth, and hopefully that's not too disturbing for folks trying to listen to us. The research we'll talk about today is very much macro in its focus. We'll be talking about patterns across 2 continents, and we recognize very much that the type of patterns that we're presenting, the results that we'll show you today, require more fine-scale case study analysis in order to really get at some of the mechanisms behind what we're showing. So by no means are we suggesting that we've identified everything that's happening at these micro scales. But the work that we'll present, while macro, really does come from our own years of working at micro scales in parks, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. So I'll get into it here. So protected areas are the backbone of biodiversity conservation strategies throughout the developing world, or in the places where most of the world's biodiversity occurs today. And this is illustrated in this very simple, somewhat dated map of national parks. So this is not all protected areas. These are just national parks in sub-Saharan Africa. And you can kind of get an idea from this. The areas in black are national parks. The vast number of parks, as well as the scale, the amount of acreage or mileage, if you will, that's covered by protected areas. And this trend towards park-based conservation is only increasing in recent years. So if you look at this little inset, you probably can't see the axis, but the y-axis there is number of protected areas. This is globally, and then the x-axis is year. You can see we're looking at almost an exponential rate of increase in the designation of protected areas. I would guess this group has talked about this phenomenon before. Certainly, I have my own thoughts on this. Working with aid organizations and working with governments in Africa, I'm amazed at the number of times in which the creation or the gazettement of protected areas is tied to aid. So there's no doubt in my mind that would be one driver or one impetus pushing the creation of these protected areas, but I'm sure there are others as well. This might be a topic for discussion as we move along. In any case, we're now looking at close to 80,000 protected areas, and that is some sort of area protected for nature or ecosystem services, if you will, ecosystem goods across the globe. Now, when you're talking of developing countries, the issue of protected areas is often a sensitive one, and understandably. Many of the protected areas that we have today in sub-Saharan Africa and in Latin America are carryovers of areas set aside by colonial governments. So to some, the photo of Salou there in the bottom corner is a historical point of reminiscence, and for others, he's an emblem of colonial rule gone wild. The sort of set aside or the appropriation, or if you will, misappropriation of vast amounts of land for, in some cases, for the use of colonial governments to extract resources such as ivory or other natural resources. And so there's certainly, as most of you will know, a very mixed history here, and and the process by which parks are created is a hotly debated one, and for many researchers and for many communities, the creation of parks is seen to come at the cost of local communities and for the benefit of international communities or for centralized governments. Though parks today also still have certainly their economic benefits, and one of the major benefits that's talked about quite a lot is tourism, ecotourism, but certainly hunting or other forms of legal resource extraction are also major sources of revenue for protected areas. And this is not only common in the big five game countries of sub-Saharan Africa, but it's also increasingly common in Latin America, where tourism continues to provide, or increasingly provides, a large source of internationally derived revenue. But game viewing is not the only source of revenue or value of these protected areas for economies and livelihoods. What we're seeing increasingly, for example, in this area of just south of the Ruaha National Park in central Tanzania, is our fishing communities or other communities that rely on water or intact resources such as fisheries or wildlife, where these communities are increasingly drawn to protected areas because they often serve as the last bastions of healthy ecosystems. And as water continues to become a powerfully important area of consideration across the world, but particularly across Africa, these places that still maintain sort of healthy hydrological systems will only gain increasing focus. So here you have a community that's initially, the first slide, a community that's settled south of a protected area for access to fisheries. And then you also have employment in these protected areas where you have staff or guards or other such positions created. For example, Mole National Park in Ghana, another area where I work. You also, and many of you know about this, see a good and increasing number of services or amenities such as schools, clinics, sanitation, and other such services that are often placed on the edges of protected areas or in communities around protected areas. And in many cases, it's quite openly stated that the goal of these amenities, the reason that these international funds are being put into these communities, is to sort of increase tolerance for the protected area. So to kind of change the balance there, to show that there is a true benefit to being, to enduring human-wildlife conflict and all the other potential costs of living near a protected area. There should be some trickle down of tourism dollars that also goes into local communities. So I started with a sort of grand scale ecotourism, and certainly that should benefit local communities as well. I mentioned fishing, but something that I study quite a lot is bushmeat hunting, and the hunting of wildlife for human consumption and livelihoods. And of course, protected areas have become a focus, have become true refuges for wildlife populations, for huntable wildlife populations in many areas of the world. And because of this, they're areas that are attractive to hunters. So I sort of tried to lay out some of the history and some of the negative conceptions or thoughts on protected areas, but also some of the potential benefits. When George and I were sort of setting out to embark on this research, we came up with our own quick list, and part of this list was came from other internal papers from USAID and other groups. But basically, what we came down to were a series of factors that we thought could attract communities, could attract immigration to protected areas, and that would be schools and clinics and other types of services that were put in place through international donor funding or through national donor funding, employment, as I mentioned, enhanced ecosystem services, so the wood, the wildlife or water or other types of provisions that could be found in protected areas but were increasingly rare or expensive outside of protected areas. Market access, so what we're seeing increasingly is a form of development around protected areas. A way to increase tourism is to link protected areas through paved road networks, but of course that could also be attractive for individuals who are looking for market access for agricultural goods or other goods. And then security, and so it's quite well documented that at times of strife in some countries within Africa and Latin America, communities have turned towards guards or other forms of enforcement in protected areas as a way of sort of shielding themselves from militias or other groups. And of course that goes both ways. as I'll talk about. Some of the deterrents, well, certainly there are major land use restrictions. I talked about using resources in these protected areas, but in many of these protected areas, it's illegal to use the resources. So there's a certain risk associated with that. If you want to clear a large amount of land, you're better off moving away from a protected area. Wildlife conflict is a major issue. I think you're going to, as I noticed on the schedule, a talk about gorillas in Bwindi. So I was in Bwindi earlier this week or last week, whenever that was. And certainly elephants and gorillas coming in and stealing bananas and maize and sugarcane is a major issue if you're relying on agriculture in those areas. Just as there could be benefits with the security found in parks, there are also risks of conflict. So you have local communities sometimes dealing with park staff or local governments that are of different backgrounds or coming from different areas in the country. There's concerns about cultural degradation, or just the process by which access or exposure to international tourists affects local cultural practices, and it certainly increases the cost of living in some of these areas. And then sort of in contrast to the market access or road infrastructure attractant, the fact that many parks are placed in very rural areas, because those are places where there's still land can be acquired somewhat easily, means that living near a protected area in many cases suggests that you're quite isolated or remote from urban centers or other places. So George and I set out to try and test some of these ideas, to try and see if we could come up with, identify the relative costs or benefits of living on the edges of protected areas. And one of the ways to do that was to look at patterns of human population growth at as small spatial scales as was possible. We sort of went with the premise that understanding changes in patterns of human settlement might give us some indication on the perception of parks as an economic benefit or a cost. And so George is going to talk about how we went about actually testing some of those patterns.
All right, thanks, Justin. So Justin and I focused our work primarily on IUCN Category 1 and 2 protected areas, and these are those protected areas that limit human activities within their boundaries. So in essence, these are the protected areas at the center of this park and people debate. We also wanted to ensure that the trends that we were isolating were related to protected area effects rather than some other, well-known, well-recognized impetus for growth, such as urban migration. So we excluded any protected areas that have an urban area on their boundary, and also got rid of marine parks, and those parks established after the time when we had demographic data available to analyze. So newer parks are not included in our analysis. And we ended up with 306 protected areas that we looked at in 45 countries across Africa and Latin America. We decided to focus in on population growth directly around the park, and we chose a 10-kilometer buffer zone, which is in the figure here, shown as the beige region around the green parks. This is focusing in on Kenya in this particular image. We chose to look at the 10-kilometer boundary because we thought that was a relatively good indice of the daily travel distance a human on foot could perform, and also it's in the literature it's been used as a metric to look at the difference between protected area resources and the condition of those resources relative to areas outside in order to understand effectiveness of the protected area. So in order to keep in line with that literature, we stuck with that spatial resolution. In order to quantify growth rates, we used United Nations demographic data that were spatially at a resolution of about 4.5 square kilometers in both Africa and Latin America. The reason we focused on Latin America and Africa was actually because the demographic data was limited to those two continents. So we originally had also hoped to look at Asia, but weren't able to find a temporally explicit as well as spatially explicit data set on which to perform this analysis. And the period of time that the data was available was on a decadal temporal resolution from 1960 to 2000. Our results overwhelmingly showed that population growth around protected areas was greater than background national rural growth rates. Again, we isolated and we're looking at rural parks, so we compared the growth rates around those parks to national rural levels of growth in order to see how the difference is going on. The top histogram here shows the proportional difference between the protected area growth and that of the national rural average on a park basis. So you can see we had 245 of the 306 parks we looked at that were actually growing faster than the background rate, some drastically so, as you can see. We also looked at a country-by-country basis, taking the average population growth of the protected areas within each country and comparing that to the national rural average. This can help control for some pseudo-replication statistical issues, so it may be a preferred way to do it. But again, the results were quite strong. We had 38 out of the 45 countries showing faster growth rates on their edges. So the results were very clear that there did appear to be this much faster growth rates on the protected area boundary relative to rural areas in the same country. This is showing the results, the same results again, but looking slightly differently at looking at actual country-by-country basis. And the color schematic here shows you the relative strength of the difference between the protected area growth and the background rural rates. So red colors mean it's growing much faster than rural growth, and green means that it's growing slower than rural rates. And what you see here is Latin America actually showed stronger results than Africa. That both were significant differences. And on average across both continents, we found that protected areas were growing about 1% per annum faster than background rural rates, which is quite striking. The reason some of the countries are very red, such as Brazil, is because their background rural rates during the time of our study were actually negative. So even if a population or a protected area edge wasn't growing at all, was relatively stable, it would be faster than the background rural rates. So just to keep that in mind when you're looking at these results. There's been a lot of discussion about people may be moving to these protected areas because some of them are located in areas of rich biodiversity. Ecologically, they may be far superior regions for human agricultural use, and perhaps this is what's driving the faster growth rate rather than actually the proximity to the protected area. It's an ecological effect that we're registering here. And so we wanted to control for that, and we chose to do that by looking at the same analysis on an eco-regional basis, which are ecologically similar regions. So you're disregarding political boundaries and now looking based on ecological factors. And again, we found that the boundaries or the areas around protected areas were growing faster than similar regions ecologically. So it did not look like this was mediated by the ecosystem fertility or productivity in the system. It was the protected area proximity that was really driving the trend. This graph just shows you a comparison between the growth rates we isolated from the United Nations data versus satellite imagery of the same area. On the pixelated figure, the red shows high relative growth rates, and green is low relative growth rates to the background rural rates. And the satellite imagery shows human development. Basically, you can see deforestation around the edge of these parks. The top is a Brazilian park, and the bottom is from Zambia. And one issue we were concerned about was, which has been talked a lot about in both the development community and academic communities, is about displacement of people from within protected areas to their edges. And so we wanted to make sure we weren't just actually picking up the displacement of these people. The edges were going much faster. People had been displaced and put on the boundaries, and therefore that's what we were registering. So we looked at we looked at human population growth both within and outside the park, and we found that actually in the majority of, I think 85% of our parks, growth rates within the park were actually stable or positive during the same study period. So very few parks were showing a decrease in the human populations within the boundaries. So this led us to believe that we were actually not, our results weren't being impacted strongly by this displacement issue, which has been a very contentious issue for national or NGO conservation organizations as well as development agencies. We wanted to focus in on the mechanisms that are driving these demographic changes on the boundaries of protected areas. And now reflecting on some of the things Justin brought up earlier, we're at a very macro scale it's difficult to pull out a lot of the drivers on a case-by-case basis. The data sets are disparate. A lot of areas it's hard to access information on, say, budget or foreign aid or different development projects that have gone on in the area. So we ran into a lot of problems in this side of the project, and I think we've done a cursory analysis that gives us some indication of what's going on, but by no means does it answer a lot of the questions that I think all of us probably have about what's actually driving the changes we see. But one of the first things we were able to look at was sort of a macro scale country-by-country funding by the Global Environment Facility. And when we looked at the relative differences between protected area growth and background rural growth relative to these GEF investments, we actually found that it was positively correlated. So those countries receiving more money from the GEF tended to have faster growth on the protected area boundaries. In this graph, we separated, for more information for people who are interested, we separated the countries by continent. So Africa is actually the gray squares and Latin America is the black squares. And it shows you that the correlation was really primarily driven by Latin America rather than African countries. Secondly, we wanted to look at this possible other motivator of human immigration towards the protected area boundaries. And we chose employment as a major driver. We figured that would be a major driver of why people might come in order to find occupational opportunities. And again, this turned out to be very difficult. Some areas have very developed tourism industries, others do not. The getting data on the actual number of official or transitory occupation available for people for these different parks is almost impossible. And so we're relying on a relatively coarse metric, again, that we hope is a surrogate for general job opportunities for the park, and that was the park-based employment. So primarily this is rangers, security rangers, but it also deals with some park staff in the areas. And what we found, again, is there was a positive correlation with growth rates with park employment. And so this indicates that employment may be a benefit that people are seeing or perceiving, and that's maybe why they're moving to these areas. Also, a negative correlation on this could be, which originally when we set this up, we thought this would be a very interesting analysis, because a negative correlation could show that the number of guards or protected area staff was decreasing likelihood of people to move there or causing people to move away, as you would expect if harassment or other negative interactions between park employments and the local communities was happening at a wide basis. Finally, and probably the one closest to a lot of our hearts in conservation, and certainly Justin's work, is trying to identify what the role of ecosystem services in driving these population change we registered. And again, this is very difficult. Getting ideas of off-take from protected areas, again, is next to impossible. There's some qualitative work on a large-scale, macro-scale analysis like ours. It's really difficult to get detailed information that's comparable across all the parks. So we ended up focusing on deforestation rates around parks. And this was, we collected this information from the literature, which was established through looking at remote sensing data. So it was, again, a sort of a broad analysis where the researchers were looking at deforestation rates around different forested parks, and a number of those parks happened to be the parks that we looked at. And what we found among that sample of parks, that areas where we had the fastest growth rates around the protected area boundary also were related to faster deforestation rates. And this is deforestation outside the protected area, so just to clarify. That was pretty much as far as we could get in the mechanisms, and we'll talk a bit more about other things we'd like to look at and open up for discussion with everybody else. I'm sure people have a lot of suggestions on how to really discern what's driving these changes. But for the moment, we'll sort of talk about some of the broad policy implications that we figured came out of this work. And to start with, just to rephrase, many, if not most of the protected areas that we looked at showed that there was much faster growth rates going around them than there were in background roll rates. And we took this as an indication that there was an attraction going on between local people and protected areas. They were moving there for various reasons. And with this increased human density and faster population growth, a number of risks are occurring or are emerging around these protected areas. And first of all, the obvious one is that biodiversity conservation objectives are being impacted by higher deforestation rates, offtake rates, increasing pressure around the protected area, increased isolation. But also there's a big health risk with emerging infectious diseases and how that relates to human density. Recent work that just came out this year on where EIDs were most prevalent pinpointed that higher human density areas were the most at risk, and those near wildlife populations was a secondary correlate to those. So basically what we're looking at is these areas where you're going to have the most interaction with wildlife are having very fast growth rates and getting higher densities. So this will have ramifications for EID and emergence of infectious disease in the future.
I'll just talk about a couple other implications, and I'll just mention one thing about the Global Environment Facility Analysis, is that those funds that we looked at from the GEF were actually funds that were designated for park-based initiatives. So it's not just general funds, it's actually funds targeted towards parks. So that's also why we felt that was a reasonable analysis to look at the impact of development donor dollars on park-related population growth. Some of the other implications, and we may be getting a little outside of our results here, but nevertheless, things that would be important to talk about. You're certainly all aware of the unprecedented rates of urbanization that we're seeing across the globe, and much of that is attributed to the perception of opportunities in urban areas that is otherwise unavailable in more rural areas. If protected areas or parks are serving that same role, if they're viewed widely as targets or as viewed as fostering opportunities otherwise absent in rural areas, and if some of those opportunities or benefits are thought to have come from either national or international donor projects, then we as a donor community need to think broadly and on broad landscape scales about how we can plan the distribution of those benefits such that we minimize impacts on protected areas. If the goal of the protected area is to protect biodiversity, if we're judging the effectiveness of these areas by their ability to sustain biodiversity for generations, then it only makes sense that when we're placing water treatment, schools, clinics, road networks, and other major amenities that we think about the likely impacts of those amenities, those draws to human populations for the protected areas. Now, certainly many people will say, well, we already do ecological or environmental impact assessments and other things. And I think what George and I would say is that the considerations we're talking about means that those assessments need to be higher up on the priority list. There are examples, and as there are always examples, but of some of these amenities being placed in known wildlife corridors between protected areas, or as we've all read about, major road projects and other things coming through environmentally fragile areas. So really what we're talking about here is not cutting off communities from support that they're already receiving, but just the general approach similar to what an urban planner might do, but a general broad approach which says let's think about how we can change the spatial distribution of benefits to local communities.
And to add something to that, I know some of the talks that have gone on in this group and the next one in November talks about some of the refugee movements or the reestablishment of refugee communities, such as I think you guys had a talk on some of the Kenya refugee situation and how they're going to be put back into a location where they can continue their lifestyles. And we've seen evidence when Rwandan refugee events were occurring. Some of these refugee camps emerged in areas much to the chagrin of the local people whose area was adjacent to those refugee camps. And the result of these refugee camps and these resettlement schemes is if they're placed in at or near ecologically sensitive areas, those ecologically sensitive areas are degraded rapidly. As the refugee, Rwandan refugee is the best case I can think of, where there's major deforestation, chimp populations went extinct, et cetera, from where those refugee camps emerge, which of course is a triage situation, so it's not always open for deep thought on where it's going to occur. But again, what we're trying to put forth here is that, at some level, at some higher level, even a very quick and coarse look is thought of before a refugee camp is established or a resettlement program is set in across the landscape.
Sort of related to the land use planning idea, multi-use buffers have been in the literature and have been in the planning lexicon for decades, I'm sure. That general idea being that you'll have different levels of protection, maybe different concentric circles moving outward from a protected area, where individuals are able to use a certain outer area for some types of hunting or collecting, and then with increasing levels of protection as one moves towards a core area. And this has been implemented in some places, and I haven't seen sort of the ultimate analysis of its effectiveness. But generally what we're seeing, what many of us are seeing in our own research, is that some of the best sort of protection, if you will, of biodiversity is through isolation. Basically isolation or limiting access to individuals on foot is one of the most effective ways to sort of sustain wildlife populations or forest resources or others. And so this is sort of where possible, the idea of reestablishing or creating multi-use buffer zones that make core areas less accessible may be a strategy to continue to allow individuals to benefit from their proximity to nature, their proximity to protected nature, while also sustaining for the long term the biodiversity in these protected areas. I don't know what we're going to say on this. This is for those of you who haven't seen it. This is the paper that we published that came out this summer, and it contains a lot of as much discussion as one can fit in a 3-page paper on some of these issues. But we also have a large free online appendix that includes a fair amount of other kinds of sort of meandering and ideas that George and I came up with that couldn't fit into the paper. Do you want to talk about these?
Yeah, so one of the questions we were asked when we were invited to come speak was to bring up any challenges that we've had towards the work, either during the review process or during the subsequent publication. And to get to the demography side, which I'll start with, the more technical side, we had a lot of questions about how we define urban versus rural growth. And this, you can see, would have major implications on our results. And a couple of people actually performed the same analysis and came out with less strong results. And essentially they did this by changing how they defined what an urban area was. So to go over how we did it, we actually, first of all, we selected these parks, again, that were rural, calculated their growth rates, and then we compared that to official UN background rural growth rates. But there was another way we looked at this as well, and that was by excluding urban extent areas using a global urbanization map, and we excluded it from the demographic data set from which we calculated these growth rates. And then we calculated what we would term rural growth rates from that method. And we were a little less hesitant. Actually, the results were less strong, but showed the same significant trend that protected areas were growing faster than background rural rates. But the problem with this method was that, just to highlight, this is from Rio de Janeiro. Actually, the urban extent doesn't cut out all of the high density, high growth areas in an urban setting. And so this was sort of, the problem is a lot of these global data sets don't perfectly align, so they're slightly off, in this case by a few kilometers. But in that case, we're actually including some of the highest density, highest growth regions in our rural metric. So we were concerned about this method, although the results again supported the analysis again supported our results. This is Nairobi. Actually, someone who put in a technical comment to Science about this, they chose to use these settlement points, these black dots, and they excluded all the pixels that overlapped with these settlement points, and used that to calculate their rural growth rate. And so we were using this just to point out that the settlement points do very little justice to what the actual urban extent is and the urban density. So I think that's not an appropriate comparison for this analysis. We also had some interpretive challenges.
Okay, yeah, I can talk about these. One of the challenges was some researchers suggested that that communities living near parks really don't receive the benefits that we were describing in our paper. You know, they said, well, sure, international donor organizations may be putting hundreds of millions of dollars into park-related development every year, but very few communities see this. And so I touched on this before, but we responded, and I think if you read the paper, you'll see that we really focus on the idea of perceived benefits. And as I said before regarding urbanization, many of the individuals, probably I dare say most of the individuals who are moving to urban areas are not realizing their dreams of wealth and prosperity in those urban areas. And while we certainly hope more individuals are realizing their goals while moving to protected areas, we certainly would in no way contend, nor have we ever contended, that individuals are actually acquiring all of these benefits. And considering the plight of many rural agriculturalists, it's not hard to believe that it wouldn't take a great deal of perceived benefits to drive people to sort of pull up shop and move. We were also challenged on the idea that the GEF alone could give enough money to protected areas to actually drive immigration to those sites, and we in our defense, it may sound strange, I'm introducing these arguments and then defending ourselves, but we were sort of asked. So Gib left, but he asked us to do this, so I'll blame him while he's gone. But we just pointed out that we use the GEF as just one indicator. And we've actually, one of the things George and I have been doing is trying to get EU funding, a detailed EU funding history has just been made available online, so we're trying to go back and add that. As we continue to move through this, what we think we'll see, as we are able to bring together USAID, EU, GEF, and maybe even park-specific funding information, which the IUCN has, individuals at the IUCN have proposed to help us do, that will really get a much clearer, sharper picture on the relationship between donor investment and population growth around protected areas. Do you want to say it?
Another challenge we got was regarding if what we were actually picking up was growth that was sort of started before the protected area was established, or after the gazettement of the protected area. And this is also a very difficult question to address, because a lot of the protected areas that we use have a gazettement date when they became IUCN Category 1 or 2, or the most exclusive type of protected area, but many had a history of some sort of protection before as a colonial hunting reserve, or some sort of less official status. So I think there are a few in there that were probably gazetted as a protected area with no previous standing, but most of them have some history. So it's difficult to actually say what is before the protected area was there and what is after. The other thing is that we focused on these very rural parks that don't have urban settlements or large urban settlements. In this case was a city over 5,000 people, so it actually might be a large village on their boundaries. So in that case, we don't think that that the protected areas we were looking at were set up in response to pressures from human population change in the beginning, and so we thought that wasn't. We weren't too concerned about that impacting our result. But one thing that was very interesting, this was brought up actually in the review process for the paper that we thought was a very good point, was that our results show faster growth rates, but if the communities living around parks are highly impoverished, what we all know is the most impoverished communities in the world are growing the fastest. So what we might actually be picking up is that the protected areas are having a negative effect to such an extent that they're causing the intrinsic growth rates of the community to be much higher than background rates, because they're being so depressed, these communities. And this was something that we did want to look at. We sort of had maintained the whole time that a lot of this was because of immigration, these faster growth rates. And the reason we sort of assumed immigration was some of the growth rates we were picking up were faster than what is possible for human populations to intrinsically grow at. So obviously in those cases it had to be immigration that was driving the growth rates. But what we added to the analysis, and isn't actually in the paper, is we wanted to take a look at if any indices of poverty were stronger next to protected areas versus areas farther away from protected areas. And the indice that we were able to get a global database again on in order to perform the analysis was infant mortality, which is strongly correlated with poverty levels. And again, what we found was that there was no statistical differences between areas next to protected areas and those farther away. So this by no means shows that intrinsic growth isn't influencing the results we saw, but it indicates pretty strongly that it's not a major driver between the difference in protected area edges and other background rural areas in the same nation.
Am I talking about these?
Yeah.
So we'll just we've kind of gone over time, so I'll just generally just say that as we move forward here, our major effort is to take some of the patterns we've observed, some of the mechanisms that we're suggesting may be responsible for the patterns that we've observed, and look at these at finer scales. And so we've been delighted by the response from various communities. We have anthropologists who've said, I was wondering what to do with my PhD. I'm now heading off to Ecuador, and I'm going to these protected areas, and I'm going to prove you wrong, which we think is great. Prove us wrong, but go and collect the data. And so, and much of what we're doing in each of our groups and together is just to try and look at some of these mechanisms at finer scales. And that really does require an interdisciplinary approach and working with folks from agencies and really trying to get access to data sets that may not be so publicly available. I was not going to say anything more about that. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And we can answer questions if folks want to know more about that. And I'll just go through this very quickly as well. Again, I just said it a second ago, but we've had a positive response, sometimes more of a, combative in a friendly way, I guess if I can say that, response from individuals at agencies and other groups who wish to follow up on this. And this is also very exciting. George and I, whether we like it or not, are somewhat, have felt somewhat trapped in the ivory tower, but we realize where the work gets done and who actually does the work and how this difference might be made, and that's how differences are made, and that's another reason why we're excited to be here. We have had conversations, as I mentioned, with IUCN about their data collection and what they can do to try and comment or inform this decision. Preliminary, some discussions with folks at USAID about forming working groups, or at least bringing folks together to talk more about these issues. And then individuals at Berkeley in the Bixby Reproductive Health group are quite interested in looking at that issue of intrinsic growth and health around protected areas. So
we've also had a number of colleagues be like, yeah, what's the big deal? We all know this is happening. So why do you guys get a nice paper out of it? Which is reassuring in a lot of ways.
So I apologize if we've gone over.
Oh, terrific. Appreciate it. Jason, why don't we give you a chance to make some opening discussion comments, and then we'll throw it open to the floor.
Should I pull your slides up here?
I don't need them yet, but
okay.
I'll cue you. When
Okay. I'll show my multitasking.
Sure. First, thanks, Jeff and Gib, for the opportunity to come here today and comment on this paper. First thing I'd like to do is commend the authors on using two publicly available spatially referenced data sets for analysis that's relatively innovative. These UNEP IUCN or the UNEP IUCN World Database on Protected Areas and the UNEP Population Distribution Database are excellent resources both for researchers, conservation organizations as well. And I think the authors illustrate how the global extent of the data can be used to examine regional and global population environment relationships and patterns that are often studied at the case study level. So although you say we need more microanalysis, I say, hey, this is one of those opportunities where by studying a large number of countries and protected areas, this work helps us move beyond our thinking and the inherent limitations of single case studies focused on a single protected area. So I commend you on that. These databases from UNEP, along with several developed at CSUN, or the Center for International Earth Sciences Information Network. That's a long one, sorry. Including one that's called the Gridded Population of the World, and another one called the Global Urban Rural Mapping Project, or colorfully acronymed GRUMP. These data sets provide conservationists, planners, policymakers, and the public, really, with increasingly detailed information about demographic dynamics in their areas of interest. And I see this as someone who's particularly passionate about improving access to and ease of use of demographic data as a positive thing. Looking more closely at their analysis, I'd like to first point out that this research is really the next step, building on Cincotta and Engelman's work from 2000 that showed population growth rates in biodiversity hotspots are higher than global rates or developing country rates. So that was sort of an initial look that we had at this, and I think this analysis goes further. In their presentation, as we saw, they're able to analyze growth rates for individual protected areas, compare those with national rural rates, and which is a finer scale of analysis than was done by Cincotta and Engelman. And they still find, as they said, that population growth rates are higher in the vast majority of cases. My first question, I'll let you answer it later, is why don't you take the comparison a little further and look at rural population growth rates for the areas where the protected areas are located? So compare the buffer itself with the rural rates where that protected area is located. I think that you could do that with the data available, and it would it could make the argument even more compelling if it results in the same statistical findings. You may have done it, and you can fill me in later. The authors and many other researchers have pointed out that high growth rates have implications for conservation, both in terms of land cover change, which they noted in terms of the deforestation, and biodiversity loss. This isn't new news. But surprisingly, at the World Conservation Congress, which took place 2 weeks ago, and which several of us had the opportunity to attend, there was still scarcely a mention of population growth or other demographic factors. So again, I appreciate the fact that the authors are waving the flag, are keeping it on the radar screen, and are urging us to look at the role of demographics in conservation of protected areas. Now, I have a couple, however, of more critical comments, and I know that you guys were expecting them, and and I'm sure you've gotten some of them. But I think that my comments will actually, hopefully, provide you with some additional avenues of thought beyond the ones that you presented there. I want to I'll try to keep this brief, and Jeff, if I'm going on too long, feel free to pull the mic. My first issue is a note of caution regarding the gridded population data and the scale of analysis. They didn't talk about it that much, and many of you might not be that familiar with them. So I am a population person, so I looked at them. I said, how do we know? How do we know about the population in a 10-kilometer buffer area around a national park? So I wanted to know more about that. And it turns out that the creation of this gridded population layer depends on the size of administrative units for which you have population data, and on the way that you take that number for an administrative unit and you throw it across a grid so that every cell has now a population number. You don't do it evenly. That wouldn't make sense. People aren't living evenly across that administrative unit. And this was not their work creating this, so it's not a criticism of you guys. But basically, you have to depend on looking at different transportation networks and making assumptions and decisions about how that population is distributed across the grid. There are inherent errors in this process, and the original creators of this data tried to validate the grids, but I think there are some challenges when you get down to the scale of a 10-kilometer buffer. And I'd ask them, is there are there ways that we can check or validate these, and did you look into that? And I think it's particularly important in areas where protected areas are located, because you have large administrative units and you have a sparse population. And that thus means that the problem is magnified. In fact, UNEP's discussion of the data, and I'll quote them, says that the differences are acceptable in relatively homogeneous regions, but are obviously quite large in areas where population distribution is very scattered. Okay. My second issue, so that's part one. My second issue is with the author's determination that migration is driving population growth around protected areas, and I think they talked about this a bit. And I think they're interested in looking into the possibility of intrinsic growth. And what's intrinsic growth? Births minus deaths, right? We're just talking about the part that's not migration, that is playing here. I don't think the examination of infant mortality rates as a proxy for poverty and the determination that poverty is not lower around protected areas is adequate. I think you already know that there are some challenges to doing it that way. Measures of infant mortality are notoriously poor at small scales, and I challenge you, and it sounds like you're looking into this, I challenge you to go to the next step in assessing what portion of growth is due to migration, what portion is due to natural growth. This analysis is going to take a lot of time, and you're probably going to need a demographer, and I'm not volunteering. But it's really necessary given the documented high fertility in remote rural areas. There are a number of papers that have come out recently. In my place, the place that I love most in Ecuador, where I've done most of my work, for example, the total fertility rate, actually if you could draw up that map for me now, Justin, that would be wonderful. This is Amazon area of Ecuador. It turns out that the total fertility rate for the Amazon, while it's decreased from 5 births per woman to 4.2, according to the most recent DHS survey, comparing that with the national rate, rural rate of 3.3, indicates that fertility is quite a bit higher in the Amazon. Moreover, the total fertility rate among indigenous populations, among whom I did my dissertation work, is estimated at 7 to 8 births per woman. So it's significantly higher, and it is a contributing factor, at least in this area of Ecuador and around these protected areas. Despite my reservations about that and about how they came to the conclusion that migration is the main factor, I tend to agree with them. I tend to agree that migration is driving higher population growth in areas of high biodiversity and around these protected areas. So I certainly don't contend that that's not the case. However, the reasons for migration, I think, are diverse. And my third issue here is that I don't think the authors provide adequate evidence to show that conservation investments are driving migration to these areas, or not just conservation investments, but the protected areas themselves. Why do I take issue with this finding? I like to work in threes, so I'll give 3 main reasons, and I'll be quick about it. The number of protected areas in the world, as they noted, and if you could just advance one slide, Justin showed this one as well, coming from UNEP's site. It's grown, as he mentioned, amazingly in the last 40 years. And at the same time, during the same 40 years, the populations of most African and Latin American countries have at least doubled. So they've doubled at least once. Some of them have doubled twice. What does that mean? It means that we have the creation of protected areas happening in countries that are growing very quickly, and there has to be a place to put these protected areas. So we ask, where are protected areas usually located? I think you'll find that protected areas are located most often in areas where there is a great amount of land availability. So you have large areas that are already sparsely populated. Given that population growth is so rapid in other parts of the country, what we're seeing is that areas that are historically settled, there's no land available in those areas anymore, and colonists are migrating to new frontiers, seeking available agricultural lands. So I think both Rwanda and Ecuador provide examples of this. If you could just advance me one slide there. I talked about Rwanda. I'm going to go to the, George was talking about the refugee situation on the west side of the country. I'm just going to turn to the east side of the country, and these guys probably know this situation better than I. This is Akagera National Park. This was a sparsely populated area, and the national park was 3 times larger than it is today before the genocide in 1994. When you had a large movement of people back into the country after the changes there in 1995 through 1997, I believe, there was an influx of a lot of people who had lived out of the country for 20, 30, 40 years, and they came wanting to start agricultural livelihoods. Rwanda is also one of the most densely populated countries in Africa. So where to put them? Well, they reduced Akagera National Park by 2/3, so now it's 1/3 its original size, and the government created settlement areas here. Now, this is an extreme case where the government forced the issue, but if we turn back to Ecuador, a similar thing is going on in Ecuador, but not planned. In Ecuador, in this area around these national parks, is an area of high colonization, not because of national parks, but because of what I'll bring up as my second issue, extractive natural resource based industries, which provide lucrative jobs in the areas around protected areas. And I'd argue that you need to look at these industries, including timber, mining, oil and gas, industrial agriculture, as providing migrants with far greater economic benefits than what I would call meager amounts spent on conservation. I think tourism is the only factor that would compete with these, and only in those areas that are visited, that see a high number of visitors. And I agree with you. I think tourism, although you haven't been able to look at it yet, but having, and again, this is another challenge that I'm not going to volunteer for, but having visitors for each park, number of visitors or something like that, would provide some additional data there. My last point. Finally, the correlation between population growth and GEF spending, or population growth and protected area staff, could, as the authors note, and they didn't talk about today, it could simply mean that conservationists are wisely spending their limited dollars in protected areas faced with the greatest threats. So that what we're seeing is that those protected areas with the greatest number of staff and receiving the greatest amount of money are those that are experiencing the greatest population growth and therefore are under threat. You might be able to address that by doing some lagging analysis. We don't really want to get into that here, but we can talk about it later. Okay, so based on these points, I tend to agree with the authors on their original finding about the population growth, and I think it's innovative, and I commend them for it. I have to disagree with you guys on the conclusion that international donor investment in conservation might be fueling this population growth. It could be. I think we need to go further in examining that, and I hope that the publishing this conclusion here in Science doesn't provide our detractors, those who don't want us to be spending money on conservation, with the means to limit future spending for international conservation. And so I take doing this work with quite a bit of caution, and more so now that I've moved to Washington, D.C. and have to think about what are the implications of the research that I do much more closely than I did when I was in North Carolina. I think this is just a start off, and I hope other people have many more questions. And I want to thank you guys. I think you did a great work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks, all three. Really tight presentations and give us a lot to look at, a lot to chew on. So why don't we throw it open to the floor. Also on the web, feel free to submit a question to ecsp@wilsoncenter.org, and if it's here early, we'll try to get it into the mix. And I should have said ahead of time that the PowerPoints, I think, are up on the website, so you can pull them down And then if we use the microphones when we're doing a question. So Will, if you could bring it down here right to the front. And if everybody could just let us know who you are as part of posing your question.
Hi, I'm Larry Hausman from the Nature Conservancy. Two related questions. One, would you make the assumption that population and economic growth inside protected areas would roughly equate to what's going on just outside in the buffer areas? And second, are there any countries that formally discourage migration into protected areas, or that the buffer areas around the protected areas?
I'll take a shot at that. Well, certainly I think for the most part, growth within the parks tended to be lower than the edge, although there are cases where that's the opposite is occurring. And there are cases where population growth in the park is actually declining and the edge is increasing. And I think there were no cases where population growth on the edge was declining, but within the park was increasing in the sample that we looked at. So I hope that answers that question. Regarding active deterrence to migration to protected area boundaries, I'm not familiar with national policies of that extent, but there certainly is local politics that it's quite contentious, especially in many areas, if it's an ethnic group that is holding a certain area that's adjacent to a protected area, and a different urban migrants come in, or different ethnic groups are moving into that areas, and there's local politics that I would say act as a deterrent to that type of migration. So I'm probably not the best person to speak to that, to the national policies.
Let me just take a stab at the second question. There are a few policies where migration is explicitly addressed and they're trying to limit it. They're generally on islands. The Galapagos is the classic case where the government came up with a special policy to try to limit migration to the Galapagos, mostly driven by economic growth and the tourism. It has not thus far been successful. The other one that is not a national policy but is sometimes used by conservation organizations that I know of is, or by protected areas themselves, is providing benefits only to local residents of the park or of the communities that were originally there. So restricting conservation project investments to existing residents rather than new communities that spring up.
I would agree fully, and I think in my experience, I haven't heard of many national programs, but there are many things happening at these smaller scales. As I said, I was in a windy impenetrable forest last week, which is really widely held as a success story for ecotourism and community development, and so many organizations are there, and the clinics are there, and just talking with people in those communities, there are questions about this honeypot, the honeypot idea. Just there are questions about immigrants moving in and sharing what is a fantastic, what seems to be a really effective trickle down of tourism dollars and international support and other things. So there is talk at a community level about the distribution of resources and what it will mean if there aren't other honeypots in that area to keep everyone from moving. And this is something that's been talked about to much debate in the natural resource economics community. There was talk of sustainable harvest of wildebeest in Serengeti, and how would they maintain a stable user base for communities along the edge? Because who wouldn't come to the edge of Serengeti National Park if you could be provided that source of animal protein that's otherwise in short supply. So I've heard about it, as both these gentlemen are saying, at smaller scales, but I haven't heard about many nationalized programs.
And another follow-up, just to the other side, is there are active programs to solicit the migration of people. Not necessarily, they'll be next to protected areas, but in general, the political map, the doling out of community money from a national policy is often dictated by density. So local chiefs or local administrators will, do their best to increase their allotment of that money. So that is occurring in some of these areas, especially some of the more remote areas. They're trying to increase their proportion of the kitty in that respect.
Hannah?
Hi, thank you very much. My name's Hannah Fairbank. I'm a biodiversity specialist here at USAID, and I have two questions. One question is, have you all considered taking a look at human-wildlife conflict in these areas and the relationship between population increases and that threshold of where human-wildlife conflict may become some sort of disincentive for migration into those areas? And my other question is, are there any plans to look at marine conservation and marine protected areas? Of course, data is always a challenge and a constraint on the marine side, but it's something USAID has started to get have a heavier focus on marine conservation, and we're always interested in information on that.
I can take the first. And I know George will have things to say about this because he's spent much of his life studying elephants, and they tend to be the ones, when you talk human-wildlife conflict in Africa or sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia, it often involves an elephant. But so we have not specifically looked at human-wildlife conflict as relates to this kind of broad data set. And that I think we have colleagues who look at that issue, and that might be another topic that has for years been dealt with on a case study basis that really needs to be ramped up or extended to kind of to broader scales, and that would be exciting. We certainly consider it to be one of the major deterrents of either settling or farming on protected area edges. Some of my other work looks at baboon outbreaks and what that means for local communities, the costs of baboon outbreaks, the diseases and other things. But baboons have become Africa's #1 crop pest and #1 livestock predator. So that's another case where proximity to protected areas and baboons comes at a high cost. So I'm obviously skirting around your question because we haven't done it, unless George has done it secretly and I don't know about it.
I wish we had the data to do it.
Yeah, we wish, like many things. And just the idea of marine protected areas is a very interesting one. I mean, we excluded marine protected areas because you can't expect growth, at least on the marine side of them, unless people are building, well, there are houses on stilts and things, but the issue of fishing pressure in marine protected areas, of course, it actually relates to what we're talking about here, and that in many cases, and this is talked about in the marine protected area or marine conservation communities, that where marine protected areas are working, they're providing a huge amount of spillover of fish. I mean, those are some of the healthiest fisheries, particularly in tropical reef systems. The healthiest fisheries are within marine protected areas, but where people can't fish in those marine protected areas, they fish along the edges of those marine protected areas. And this is happening across, I study fisheries in the Gulf of Guinea off of West Africa. This is happening there, wherever they've managed to even stick in a partial marine protected area, even if it's just they sink a ship and they try and occasionally keep people out of there. Those quickly become the most productive fisheries, localized fisheries areas. So that's an interesting phenomenon where it's kind of an ecosystem service thing where people, as a result of that protection, individuals are drawn to the borders of those areas. But that's different than what you were talking about, I think, in your question.
That was the dynamic that
Yeah.
I was thinking about.
Yeah. So I've seen, again, lots of case study type things, and I've talked with people about trying to do meta-analyses on this effectiveness or success of marine protected areas, but I don't know. I think those things are still coming.
Just to follow up on that, I think it's from the data sets we're using and the way we conducted this analysis, it'd be very difficult to understand the dynamics related to marine parks and human population, just because you'd have to understand, basically where the human populations are that are accessing that marine park, or marine park's quite far out, or if it's including partial terrestrial, partial mangrove, partial marine, those kind of dynamics you'd have to fit into your analysis, and basically it got more complicated than we were. I think it would delude the message if you tried to really deal with those issues. So, and we haven't dealt with that, but it's a very important question, clearly.
I would just add that we're when we started this, we wanted to do the whole world. I mean, who wouldn't want to do the whole world? And in playing a bit with North America and Europe, some of you won't be surprised to hear that the pattern is very similar. We think for totally different, we don't have conclusive results, so George is going to start sweating because I'm talking about things that aren't in any way tested or expanded on a broad scale. But probably for totally different reasons, which is, the increased value of land that borders on green space. So we're facing a lot of the same problem. The results, some of the implications are similar in that we're isolating and this is significant for TNC and other groups that are trying to deal with connectivity and green space outside of protected areas, but we're isolating our own protected areas because of the draw, the incentive to try and build. It's like, you can build on a golf course, or you can do even better. You can build on a park. You can build next to a park. They're not going to develop that. So anyway, just for those of you who are interested, this issue of isolation and human population growth around protected areas is not just probably not just a developing world thing.
Connie?
Thank you. Connie Campbell from USAID. I work on our Amazon funded conservation programs. And as with Hannah and Jason, thanks very much for a exciting presentation and a lot of the questions that you're generating. My question is a little incoherent because I'm still trying to think this through, but it has to do with, you just mentioned what might be class-based factors in North America regarding economic levels and people's ability to live near protected areas. Mine has to do with indigenous areas. In the Amazon, many of those, in the Andes Amazon, many of the indigenous areas are overlaid with the class 1 and 2 categories. And so there might be an artifact there in terms of the indigenous population growth rates that Jason mentioned in some of the areas that you looked at. And my question has to do with both political as well as policy related statements that we just saw at the World Conservation Congress. Several indigenous leaders from the Amazon were present there, and they made very clear statements about their pride in their fertility growth rates, the number of women that they have, polygamy and whatnot, in a somewhat laughing matter, but in a very serious matter in terms of implications for conservation and their growing power. Many indigenous folks in the Amazon are now increasingly self-identifying as Amazon, and so indigenous population numbers are going up because of that. And so what I'm trying to get at with a question is, did you see or do you consider any implications for indigenous areas in other IUCN categories versus the more strict protected areas? And do you foresee that data would be available to help you tease out some of those ethnic distinctions as opposed to purely rural versus urban?
Right. Do you want to start with that? Or do you want to start?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. And we, I guess, from our approach, as we were playing with the data sets, we came up with a lot of problems in the analysis, and it quickly became clear that our best approach would be to focus the analysis on areas where we could do our best to control some of these extrinsic factors that are really going to strongly impact the results. And so, I think an approach on dealing with that type of question, again, that's going to have to be tied more closely with basic information gotten out of each site rather than done on a broad macro scale. So I guess the quick answer is that no, we did not. And the reason would be and I think that we've had some discussions since with people that are interested who may have access to that data. And I do think there are approaches you can start trying to tease out the different influence of various factors, possibly driving the growth that Jason pointed out, as well as trying to get at intrinsic versus migration and other factors. So I think it's a great direction of research that you brought up, but I'm afraid I don't have any insight to offer.
Yeah, I would just say that. So I would agree with George, and one of the first folks to contact us after the paper was published were from the IUCN, and they wanted to know specifically about growth rates around World Heritage sites, and they were interested in looking at growth rates before and after the inclusion of local communities in these World Heritage Sites. And so, as we were sort of saying in our further directions, I mean, absolutely, these are the ways to kind of take this macro analysis and start to say, can we tease apart differences within categories of protected areas or other things? And so, as George said, I mean, we openly sort of accept and encourage that type of future analysis. We would even love to be a part of it if individuals, so in the case of IUCN, they said, tell us what kind of data do you need? If we're not collecting it, we'll work on it to try. And again, that's really exciting for us because that gets at some of these things. Your question also helps us, I think, touches on one of Jason's constructive criticisms about migration versus intrinsic growth or reproduction. And I think we may have misspoke a little bit in our presentation in that, generally, I think what George and I feel is that, we covered more than 300 protected areas. The mechanisms that drive growth in some are not going to be the same as those in the others. And Jason mentioned very rightly so the role of resource extraction industries such as timber, and there's our colleagues have worked on the bushmeat industry as it explodes in relation to the placement of roads and protected areas and other things. So there are many other things going on. Our hope, our goal was not to come and point fingers at this community or others and say, hey, you guys, this is your fault. As it turned out, and maybe this is somewhat dangerously so, some of the indices we were able to pull together had to do with donor aid, and that's because the timber industry won't give us their data, and the mining industry and the oil industries aren't so happy to share. So I don't think we would say at all that this is the one explanation that's driving everything. Nor would we say it's always immigration and it's never growth and those things. Instead what we were trying to say is, hey, here's a really broad analysis. We're not saying everything fits into the same cubbyhole, but here are some general correlations. Now, as a community, let's get out and see what we can learn. Because if these, the pattern we believe is a true one, and we can talk more about the gridded population data set and our somewhat, I would say, Herculean efforts to try and validate our data. So, or at least maybe not Herculean, but they were painful. But in any case, we believe the pattern is there. Now, what's driving it? Here are some broad correlations. Now, let's get out as a community and take these seriously and try and figure them out. So.
And just to follow up on that, the correlations we showed were pretty weak in general. There's a lot of variance in the data that was not explained. The sample sizes varied between say what we had, the way we analyzed GEF money versus deforestation rates versus employment. They're not conducive to all be incorporated into a single model in order to understand the relative contributions of each of these factors. And so basically what we presented is a very rudimentary opening to the discussion is what we had hoped in putting this out. And again, probably the most critical data sets aren't available for analysis. So again, we were very worried about putting out this GEF message as well, because we didn't, and we made strides, or we made strong attempts in the paper to be like, this is, we're not saying that this is the driver, and that we don't this investment in conservation is actually backfiring, and et cetera. We talked a lot about that as we were writing the paper and putting that in, and I think we were just trying to open the various avenues that could be driving these demographic changes and just put them out for people to discuss. And it's going to take a lot more work to figure out what is, and it's going to differ, obviously. It's going to differ, in some of my experience, the factors driving migration differ within the year as well. There's sort of long-term impacts that drive people to come live on the border, but there's also seasonal impacts where they might come in the particular case where I'm in a long-term project, they're coming in to graze during drought years or dry seasons into the park, and then during the wet seasons they're dispersing away from the park, and sort of settlements are growing at the same time as they come in and go out, and more people are staying because of occupational or health or school or whatever. So there's, these dynamics are interacting with each other and they're changing over time, and it's very complex. So.
Matt Hamilton, the Association of American Geographers. I spent a few months earlier this year in a park in the state of Rio in Brazil, and it was probably one of the parks that made it into your study. There was a whole hodgepodge of folks living outside this park, including, in fact, folks from Rio, wealthy Brazilians who had bought kind of vacation homes, which was sort of another benefit of the park. And my question gets back into the issue that you touched on of inherent versus migration in terms of the growth of these parks. And I was wondering, I guess the growth, if we take it for what it is, could kind of manifest itself in different ways, and it could be trying to figure out my thought on this one here. It could manifest itself as engendering conflict and degrading the protected areas, but it could also kind of transform these communities into stakeholders of the natural resource, or possibly other things too. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on this.
I could say a couple things about that. The first is Brazil is very tricky. And we've had, I think I gave it, one of the early talks that I gave on this, I was attacked by Brazilians afterwards. No, they just, some good friends who are Brazilian sort of came and they said, wow, just the sort of and maybe this is true of a lot of other places, but the sort of convergence of the two sort of mechanisms that I suggested when I talked about developing countries and then the patterns that we see in North America, which you just suggested. So there seems to be people living on edges for opportunity, and then people moving on edges as second houses, which seems to be reflect urban affluence. And so there seems to be both of those dynamics going on. And to make matters worse, neither George or I really work in Brazil. And so, again, we kind of have gone off, kind of just have stuck to the data and say this is what it shows there. I think this issue about ownership, this kind of comes back to some of the ideas of this economic honeypot and how it's shared and who has access and how groups either encourage others or discourage other groups from coming and sharing those resources. And so in Ghana, which is one place where I work, we've just established, I say we, I'm throwing myself in there a bit, but I have been a part of it, but established 11 community resource management areas bordering protected areas. And so this is really, they call them CREMAs, community resource management areas. And this is really kind of a buffer zone effort, but it's also community-based natural resource management. And it is directly, it's all going back to all of these ideas about giving ownership and tenure to local communities to enable them to think on longer timescales than they would when these resources belong to a president or king or whatever. And so I think in those cases, actually, I'm not really sure I'm going to answer your question at all now that I think about it. I'm just going to keep going around and around. Do you have a better answer? No. So, to answer your question, actually, I would say I don't know how what you're saying is going to turn out, and I don't even know how many cases there are where it is communities taking hold of having ownership of these resources, turning into high rates of population growth and things. Oh, and one thing George mentioned that I think is important is that in many of these places, the rates that we're observing, the population growth rates we're observing between periods, is higher than what is biologically possible for humans. In those cases, it's kind of easy, or we think it's easy to say, okay, there's immigration going on here. That seems somewhat clear. Then again, there are issues with the data quality and other things that could create some of that noise. But I don't know, George, do you have a better answer?
I would say that there's quite a few cases where stakeholder communities or communities that become empowered and become in a greater stakeholder position have done a lot of or gotten a lot of leverage in bargaining with resource extraction industries. And so in that case, I think you can have benefits to both the biodiversity and the local people by having them able to leverage their position more rather than having sort of this top-down isolated decision-making going on in resource extraction. And certainly we've seen that is needed in a lot of places in Africa where it's not happening. And the central government may be quite far away is making the resource extraction decisions that have no relevance or no discussion or no input from local people. So I have basically very little to add to your question as well. No answer for it too. But I mean, there are cases where that model has been very beneficial to biodiversity, certainly. So,
ask a question about going back to or sparked by the Global Environment Facility data, and there are a number of us in the room who've worked largely looking at projects funded by USAID, and so I hope that there's a way eventually for you to get some of the data for them to look at. That is a relatively small amount of money, small amount of projects that are explicitly trying to bring people into the conservation efforts through partnerships with folks working on integrated health, including family planning, livelihoods programs for people living in and around the parks. And in some ways, it's encouraging to hear that there may be bigger pots of money and other folks spending conservation dollars in ways that explicitly are designing benefits for those populations beyond just kind of attraction of jobs, but when you talk about improved water systems or health clinics. So my question is it your sense that there's a lot of that going on, and does that come out of kind of, maybe it's just kind of really breaking down what these GEF projects are and what the money goes for? But in some ways, it's been a notion that, gosh, where are all the funders on this kind of people-based approach? As Jason pointed out, in Barcelona, it was hard to find beyond the kind of label and the rhetoric. And so perhaps in some ways, despite this potentially negative impact, the fact that folks are not, this transition of the conservation community from parks and just keep people out versus understanding that that may be a short-term strategy, that if you're kind of going to ignore the livelihood issues of people living in and around, then you're just kind of putting off the inevitable. So whether it's this new EU data or the GEF, can you say a little more about how explicit these investments in conservation are people-focused rather than kind of people having benefits that are coming from those conservation, kind of not incidental if it's in the form of clinics, but
more indirect versus
yeah.
So I mean, there's a large and growing literature within the conservation biology community, and folks like Kent Redford at Wildlife Conservation Society have been very outspoken about the hijacking of conservation by development, and that sentiment is that, and their sentiment is that more and more conservation organizations have to frame all of their activities in rural developing areas as, or they need to clearly identify the benefits for local communities in any work that they do. And that statement has become a major part of sort of the mission statements of many large conservation organizations. African Wildlife, I think they have recently added the statement that none of their work will come at the detriment to local communities and things like that. So I think generally, I think that's a good thing that we're saying, okay, we're going to work within. I mean, and that's also my approach, is to say, how are we going to work within the needs of these local communities to reach our goals? But at the same time, and I don't know this, maybe someone can point me to this, but I would love to see, and we may be the ones to build it if it doesn't exist, or at least for a few of these organizations with USAID, if we have information on USAID and GEF and EU, and I have information for DANITA, and we can get some of these other organizations, but is to build a funding map and to actually look at the spatial distribution of resources. Because I would hypothesize, and someone probably has one of these maps, and they're going to laugh at me when I say this, but I would say that that distribution will not be even by any means, and that we're going to see sort of hotspots for donor activity. And I think sometimes that those hotspots are areas where you're seeing success, and so maybe in that sort of a self-perpetuating cycle where you have success and other people are getting involved. I think Bwindi in Uganda is a great example of that, where more and more programs are benefiting from the work that others are doing. But that you're going to see huge expanses of rural area where there's very little, and then you are going to see hotspots around a lot of protected areas. You're going to see them in urban areas and around a lot of protected areas. So that doesn't exactly get at your question. And your question is how much of this is direct, or these initiatives are directly designed to benefit local communities. I think in the places we work, or in the places I work, they are sort of it will be a school, which is, a school targeted to benefit communities living on the edge of protected areas, or clinics. So in Bwindi or in Virunga and Rwanda, these are clinics that are being put in to kind of address the needs of local communities. They're being put in through conservation groups. Wildlife conservation groups are doing this, as well as those groups in association with development communities. Water sanitation, again, examples. And that's going through GEF was very nice, because they actually, in some cases, you can go through the entire project document and look at line item budgeting for different things: roads, sewage treatment, water, drinking water provisioning, and all the rest. So I don't have a quantitative answer to you, but I think what we're arguing, or what we're proposing in the paper, is that there are direct incentives for communities looking for these types of services to settle near protected areas, and that there are these organizations that are working to benefit those communities that have to put up with a park. But that there are also the indirect benefits, which are the ecosystem services in the parks that are increasingly expensive or absent in other places. So I don't know which is more important and in which places, but I don't know. I'm surprised. I didn't go to Barcelona because I was in Africa, but I'm disheartened, I guess, to hear that.
Well, Jason's got a great blog post on our new Security Beat blog with some details on that. So there is a resource for some more.
Yeah, it's quite surprising to me. I think from much of my experience and what interaction I have, that community-based approaches are almost always tied with large projects going on, except for maybe in very remote areas where they're purely focused on security. But it seems like that's almost status quo in most projects now, that there is some aspect of it. So it's interesting that that wasn't brought up. And certainly a lot of parks are implementing revenue sharing. I think this tends to be the more wealthy parks, the parks that are having more investment. But as the parks' budgets expand, I think a revenue sharing becomes almost mandatory in most of these regions as well, with revenue sharing with the direct neighboring.
Well, certainly one action item for me, and I think for this PHE community that we have here based in DC with lots of folks working in the field, is to sit down and talk with you more and have you help us unpack some of this data and figure out who's doing what, because it sounds like there's a bigger set of folks looking at it. Yes, sir, please. And then in the back.
Thanks to all of you. I'm John Shirless. I'm a conservation biologist and an advisor to the Bonobo Conservation Initiative, which works to facilitate indigenous efforts in the DRC to create community-controlled reserves on varying scales. I've got a couple of questions. First, I'm wondering whether you all have the capacity to, given the data sets that you've got, to look into, for each area around the protected areas, where you know what the difference is between the background population growth rate and the area of the 10-kilometer boundary, to see whether there are other areas with the same higher rate that are not within the 10-kilometer boundary but are within the general region. And secondly, I'm wondering what the explanation is for the exceptions to your rule. I noted on the map that Uganda, speaking of Bwindi, seems to stand out in red as not being under your what you're describing. Thanks.
Justin, before you do that, a number of hands just popped up, and I'm starting to worry about time, so maybe we collect them and then give you guys a chance to respond to them. Okay. So the gentleman in the back in the yellow, Kristen, and the gentleman over here.
So I'm Kristen Patterson with the Nature Conservancy. One of my worries when I saw the title of your study and read the paper was that people who still believe in very strict conservation will take this work to think as a way of saying, well, we actually shouldn't be providing services to people who live around protected areas. We shouldn't be trying to do, integrated conservation with development and livelihoods work, because, this is the end result is higher population growth, which will then have a negative impact on biodiversity. And I think that's reason why some of Jason's points are important to consider. Several other people have brought up the rate, the the fact of whether migration is actually being driven by natural resource use. In Madagascar, in almost all of the national parks in Madagascar, that's certainly the case. Mainly driven by mining is what's driving immigration, and then natural increase is extremely high and has been proven to be much higher around protected areas and natural areas in Madagascar because there aren't access to family planning and other health services. So I think those two questions should be looked at more closely, and I also question, I can relate to Jason's question about the data. You know, there are censuses only go down to the district level, for instance, in Madagascar. In certain districts, you know, they might, depending on what the size of the districts are, say on average they're about the size of a county, a large county in the United States. You know, right next to the park might be very low or very high population densities, but it's not evenly distributed. And the districts themselves, I mean, in Madagascar they haven't done a census in 10 or 15 years, so I'm interested to know how the data is can actually be verified. But my worry is that people will take this study and say, oh, that's a reason to stop doing this type of work, instead of saying, this is a reflection of the fact that we haven't been doing enough family planning work to address the natural high, natural increase of population in the areas.
Thanks, Kristen. Gentlemen,
Art Chimes from Voice of America Radio, where we have a lot of listeners in the areas that we've been talking about. I may have missed it, and I gather it's probably not part of the paper in Science, but what sort of conservation or ecological impact is this having actually within the boundaries of the protected areas? We've been talking about the buffer zone around it, but is the deforestation, the loss of biodiversity, is that happening inside the protected areas as well?
Okay, and then, sir, if we can collect yours, and then we'll get to you.
Yes, my name is Craig Schaefer. I'm with the National Park Service here in Washington, D.C. And I believe Justin mentioned that the multiple use buffer idea has been around for decades, and I think the conservation community has generally accepted the notion as a good idea, for protected areas. On the one hand, a buffer zone is supposed to protect the animals in the reserve, and on the other hand, it would be nice if it could somehow accommodate people living next to the reserve, maybe in some type of graded fashion. But I was wondering, based on your work, do you think this buffer zone idea maybe needs to be rethought? I mean, are we expecting too many things of a buffer zone at the same time? I mean, could that be one of the problems? I mean, is there a need to perhaps provide better guidance on how buffer zones should be designed next to reserves?
And sir, if you could just hand it to the left there. Well, that'll be our last question, I promise. Guys, you're making you take all these notes here.
Yes, my name is John Sapogas. I'm with the National Science Foundation. I guess my concern with the study is that there are 350 different sites. Many of these sites are in very dissimilar countries, ranging from South Africa to Zimbabwe, I assume. And what's happening within each of these countries, the economic activity and GDP within each of these countries is so dissimilar, and a lot of the economic activity will have a different impact on each of. So I was wondering whether you did any kind of analysis in looking at that to determine whether the variation in that had an impact on in your results.
Okay, terrific. Controlling for economic growth. Justin or George, would you like to kick off a final round here?
Maybe I'll start on some, and then George can jump in, and maybe we'll try and, if we're really good at this, we'll try and touch on some of Jason's other constructive criticisms. There was a question about, I think John asked a question, if I got the name right, about Uganda and some of the other countries that didn't follow the pattern, and that actually touches on Jason's comment about, let's see if I can get this right, about fill-in. So he mentioned this process by which if parks are placed in areas that are undeveloped, parks are preferentially placed in areas that are undeveloped, which is generally seems to be true and seems to be accepted, then maybe what we're seeing is just the fill-in over time of populations into those areas because there's less competition for resources. And that's my explanation for Uganda and other, if you look at some of our countries with higher population densities, it was almost impossible to find parks that didn't have human settlements over 5,000 people within their buffer areas. And so I think in Uganda we ended up with one park. Is that right?
Kadepo.
Yeah, Kadepo. We were only able to look at one park, and I think, and even there, the baseline population densities were so high, even at the beginning, that we were unable to really pick up much of a trend at all.
Just to follow up on that, Kadepo is up in the northern region of the country. It's in very arid land. A lot of the heaviest rural growth is in the more mesic areas around Lake Victoria, and on top of that you have Lord's Resistance Army activities going on in those regions and causing massive migration out of those areas. Similarly, some of the negative growth we found came from, I think, Sierra Leone, where there's been major civil conflict. This wasn't, we looked at this in general, it's complicated to state that it's purely a civil conflict result that causes negative growth, but that was part of it in some of these areas. So that's just to explain the Uganda.
Yeah. And it kind of touches on the question about the huge amount of variation between countries. I mean, we had cases where, there may have been a slight temptation to throw a country out, but as it, we thought rather than get rid of Uganda, which seems to fly in the face of the rest of our result, we would stick it in there and face the questions. And so everything is in there, and I think maybe George will talk in a minute. We did look at GDP and other economic correlates. But I wanted to touch on the really significant question about the message from the study and about, George and I have both worked in mostly wildlife research and conservation for our lives, our adult lives, and we've benefited from the amount, international donor investment in these protected areas. This donor investment supports research often, and we've also lived and worked in the communities around the parks that have seen benefits from these communities. So I think it would be kind of a hugely depressing outcome for both of us. We might go and become professional bowlers or something if we actually felt that this study was going to lead to a large group of people that said, look, see, we told you you were wasting your money spending it on protected areas. You're just making the problem worse. That is truly not how we feel. I think at one point we had a whole paragraph of strong caveats, and I think, and this is kind of, I'm scapegoating the editor, but in that going through the editorial process, we got cut down to this statement: by no means should this possibility rationalize reduced funding for protected areas and the communities around them. Instead, it suggests that international and local funding must go in part toward developing spatially dynamic protected area systems that account for patterns of human settlement and the needs of local communities. And that is the theme on which all of our work pushing forward resonates. And that also ties in with the buffer question. One reason everyone agrees buffers are great, but you can't put them in because you can't now move all of these communities that are living on the edges of the core, living on the edges of the protected areas. And so I don't think I don't think a solution is to go in and say, okay, everybody, you're out. We did that already, and some countries still do that. But I don't think in any way that's what the international community or the U.S. should be advocating. So I think it's really a question. What we're pushing for here is to say, where are the places where we're still making these decisions? Where are the places where, for example, the greater Ruaha ecosystem, where you have game areas bordering on forest areas, bordering on national parks? How do we work within these systems to try and maintain this kind of spatially dynamic? I mean, it's kind of hand-waving maybe in the paper, but we really mean working with existing protected areas, working with places that still can be secured, maybe through Nature Conservancy Africa or Nature Conservancy or other groups that have the flexibility to work with local organizations, or maybe working with indigenous communities. But how can we scale up from a project-by-project basis and start thinking about landscapes? And the last thing I was going to say, you asked about, and Jason raised the issue of the credibility of the data, particularly at the scales at which we're looking. The best validation we could do was actually for the country of Ghana, which has village-level data. I mean, we're talking like 2 households are included. And I've done a bit of validation working there a bit just at those, and so they're not perfect, but they're not. It's not modeled. It's not like the rest of it, where you're taking district level and you're modeling it. I mean, these are real village levels, and the data hold up incredibly well. The model data hold up incredibly well across that whole country. But does that mean that they hold up everywhere? We don't know. We really don't know. Would we love to do many more validations? Absolutely. We started with Tanzania, or with Kenya. Was it Tanzania or Kenya?
Kenya. We tried. We spent a lot of time.
We compared modeled versus sub-district level, anything that we could get our hands from. And this is maybe where geographers, demographers, others can help us. But as we got into this and started talking with people at the UN about how they use the data and those things, we were amazed at how little concern there was about the quality or accuracy of the data. So I'm not going to tell you that we think it's perfect. We've been through our greatest challenges, and sometimes nasty challenges, have been about our analysis of those data. And so I would encourage you, if you have the time, to look at our online supplement. And you can at least see, it won't answer all the questions, but you can at least see some of our efforts where we compared things at different scales and levels to try and say something about what we felt were the biases and quality of these UN and UNEP and UNDP data. There were some other questions. You want to touch on the GDP?
Yeah, just to follow up on what's in the supplementary material as well, is when we were doing those, we spent a lot of time looking for data sets and trying to figure out. It gets very difficult when you're looking over time at fine-scale data. Very fine-scale administrative units change their names, their sizes continually over between 1960 and 2000 in many countries that had fine-scale data, making it almost impossible for us to. It was impossible in the time we sort of had to reconstruct what had actually happened at some of these finer resolutions. So it became very difficult for us to get at the accuracy. We did the best we could with the data available. One thing that's interesting that doesn't really address looking at the protected area growth versus areas in the same district, same rural areas in the same district. We didn't actually do that, but one thing we were able to do was look at if this was a district effect as well. Districts boarding or with protected areas grew faster than those without. And we actually found that those districts were growing faster than those without. And interestingly, we were like, oh, well, this is probably driven by urbanization of those districts. And what was interesting to us is we actually looked at that and we found that, in fact, the protected area districts tended to have smaller cities and less cities than those without. So I thought, whatever that means, again, now we're stepping back to a coarser level, but again, those results supported that there's faster growth going on in these areas with protected areas than there are, and that's regardless of urbanization. So I thought that was an interesting result. There is, our big concern with the work has always been the resolution of the data, and we would try to attack our analysis in every way we could and disprove it and see what happened, and it stood our best shots at it. If that's for better or for worse, it's hard to say. But again, there's a lot that can be done, and there's a lot that should be done. To move on, I wanted to just start. One of the questions we had was, what were the ecological impacts of these higher population growth rates on the borders of protected areas? And actually, Justin, I'm just going to have Justin, he's done work on actually looking at population density around protected areas and extinction rates within them in Ghana. And I think his work is probably the best available for us that's actually looked quantitatively, analytically at that question. And it showed, just to take Justin's wind out of his sails, it showed that actually higher density areas tended to have greater numbers and extinction rates in those protected areas. So that work, that was done for Ghana, again. And so there has been some direct correlates. We didn't look at, I think now with the level of remote sensing data that's becoming available, there's going to be a lot of research on looking at ecological change and across a variety of different landscape and land use patterns in the world now, because we're being able to get a lot of this remote sensing data publicly available for people to analyze. So those questions are going to be analyzed or answered in the next 5 years, I would guess.
Yeah, can I just add to Art's question, and your answer to Art's questions about impacts within parks, is that, so I have worked on that, and there is a literature within the conservation biology community, probably now 40 or 50 papers where people are using population density on the edges of parks are determining that population density along edges of parks is pretty much the number one predictor of the trend or status. Usually it's wildlife, but often it's actually timber or non-timber resources as well. So or fire frequency as well. And we didn't go into that in our paper, and we thought, we would let that literature sort of speak for itself.
Guys, I'm sorry to cut this off because it's obviously a lot there and very rich, but we've gone quite a bit over, and I'm certain that we folks who will be coming into the room would love to do that soon. Yeah. So thank you all for really a good set of questions, and I urge you to come up and talk to our panelists further about it. Thank you, Jason, for such a careful reading and constructive set of suggestions, and Justin, George, thanks so much for making the trip out to share this with this Washington audience. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.